The sun was beginning to dip behind the jagged glass rooflines of Golden Heights, casting long, elitist shadows across the perfectly manicured Kentucky bluegrass lawns. This was a place where the air itself smelled of expensive cedar mulch and silent judgment. Kenji Sato pulled his dented, 10-year-old station wagon to the curb, the engine giving a final, weary rattle that felt like a sacrilege in the quiet of the cul-de-sac. He stepped out, the cool evening breeze catching his faded local 42 windbreaker. His joints ached from a long day, but he forced a smile as he opened the passenger door for his mother. Mrs. Sato, her back slightly curved from decades of labor, clutched a brown paper grocery bag like it was a precious heirloom. Behind them, 7-year-old Mika hopped out, her small hands gripping a plastic tub of homemade pickled ginger, her eyes bright with the simple excitement of being home. The peace was shattered by the high-pitched whine of a precision-tuned engine. A matte black supercar drifted around the corner, its tires chirping against the asphalt before it screeched to a halt inches from Kenji's bumper. The door swung upward with a hydraulic hiss, and Julian Vane stepped out. He looked like he had been curated by a luxury magazine. His suit was a crisp, charcoal weave, his hair was perfectly gelled, and his face was set in a permanent sneer of inherited superiority. He didn't just walk, he marched toward them, his Italian leather shoes clicking aggressively against the pavement. He didn't look at Kenji's face, he looked at the windbreaker, the dented car, and the grocery bags with the kind of intense revulsion one might reserve for a crime scene. Julian didn't bother with a greeting. He checked his rose gold watch and sighed with exaggerated exhaustion. He asked if they had any idea how much their presence was dragging down the neighborhood's aesthetic. He spoke loudly, ensuring his voice carried to the neighboring villas. He told them that Golden Heights was designed for a certain caliber of person, and frankly, looking at them, it was clear a mistake had been made. Before Kenji could respond, a front door nearby swung open. Sheila, the self-appointed neighborhood watchdog, hurried down her driveway with her smartphone already raised, the screen glowing as she began to record. She didn't offer a hello either. She just pointed the camera at Mika and demanded to know what they were doing loitering on a private street. She claimed she had seen their kind wandering around lately and that she was already hovering over the button to call the police. The tension in the air became thick and suffocating. Julian leaned in closer to Kenji, the smell of his cologne, something cold and metallic, overpowering the scent of the groceries. He looked down at the bag Mrs. Sato was holding and told them that the neighborhood had rules about ethnic odors and visual clutter. He said it was people like them who turned prestigious zip codes into slums. In that moment of intense heat, Mika's grip slipped. The plastic tub of pickled ginger hit the driveway with a wet thud, the lid popping off and spilling the bright pink contents across the pristine, dark asphalt. Julian reacted as if he had been physically struck. He let out a sharp, jagged laugh of pure disbelief, pointing a manicured finger at the mess. He screamed at them to look at the filth they were bringing to his street. He called it ethnic garbage and told them they were a stain on the community. He stepped right into Kenji's personal space, his eyes flashing with a predatory gleam, and told them they had until sunrise to pack their things. He claimed he sat on the board of the WA and that he owned this street in every way that mattered. He told Kenji that trash belonged in the bin, not on his curb. Kenji didn't flinch. He didn't shout back or raise his hands. He simply stood his ground, his shadow stretching out toward the lot across the street, a massive, empty plot of land that was currently the most expensive piece of real estate in the county. He looked at the "for sale" sign standing there and then looked back at Julian with a terrifyingly calm expression. He asked Julian if it was really the ginger he hated, or if he was just terrified of neighbors who didn't need a suit to have power. Julian just scoffed, telling him to save the philosophy for the bus ride out of town. As Julian and Sheila turned away, laughing about the infestation they were finally clearing out, Kenji reached down and gently helped his daughter pick up the container. He whispered to her that some people build walls because they are afraid of what is on the other side, but they forgot one thing. Walls can be bought and sold. The cold night air of Golden Heights felt thin and hollow, but as Kenji sat in the dim glow of his small study, the world around him began to dissolve, replaced by the heavy, oil-slicked memories of 25 years ago. Back then, the air didn't smell of cedar mulch. It smelled of salt, rusted iron, and the bone-deep exhaustion of the Seattle shipyards. A younger Kenji, his hands calloused and stained with grease that no soap could ever truly remove, stood under a flickering floodlight at 3 in the morning. He remembered the way the rain felt, not like a refreshing mist, but like 1,000 icy needles driving into his skin through a thin, yellow raincoat. He was working 3 jobs, surviving on lukewarm coffee in the singular, burning drive to send every spare cent back to his parents. He wasn't just a laborer, he was a brilliant structural engineer with a mind that could see the stresses in steel and the geometry of the future. But his dreams had been surgically removed by a man with a much more famous last name. Julian's father, Arthur Vane, had been the one to tighten the noose. Kenji could still see Arthur's face, the same cold, predatory eyes Julian had inherited, as he sat behind a mahogany desk and informed Kenji that his revolutionary patents were now property of Vane Industries. When Kenji tried to fight back, Arthur didn't just fire him, he systematically dismantled his reputation, blacklisting him from every firm on the West Coast until Kenji was reduced to hauling scrap metal just to buy bread. He remembered coming home to find his mother, then a vibrant woman with laughter in her eyes, standing over a steaming industrial sink in a cramped restaurant kitchen. She was working 16-hour shifts, her hands swollen and red from the scalding water, all because they had lost their family home to a predatory loan orchestrated by one of Arthur's shell companies. The shame of that loss had been a physical weight, a constant pressure in his chest that never quite went away, even as he spent his nights studying the very financial systems that had been used to crush him. In a sharp contrast of memory, he saw a teenage Julian Vane. The boy had been lounging on the terrace of a private country club, wearing a white polo shirt that cost more than Kenji's monthly rent. Julian had been laughing with his friends, mocking a waiter who had tripped, calling the man the help, and background noise. Arthur Vane had stood nearby, watching his son with a twisted pride, leaning in to whisper that the world was divided into 2 kinds of people: those who owned the dirt, and those who were buried under it. What Julian never knew, and what Arthur had spent millions to hide, was that the very land Golden Heights was built upon had once belonged to Kenji's grandfather. It had been stolen through a corrupt eminent domain claim during a time when men who looked like Kenji had no voice in the courts. The memory shifted back to the present as Kenji's desk lamp flickered. He looked down at an old, yellowed map of the neighborhood, its edges brittle and brown, and compared it to a modern digital tablet glowing with a bank statement that carried a 9-figure balance. The numbers were staggering, a mountain of wealth built brick by brick, patent by patent, under a dozen different corporate names that the Vanes would never recognize. The phone on the desk vibrated, the screen lighting up with the name Leo. Kenji picked it up on the first ring, his voice low and steady, stripped of the humble, tired tone he used with the neighbors. Leo, his most trusted assistant and the man who ran the day-to-day operations of Kenji's global tech empire, confirmed that the acquisition phase was complete. Every debt Julian Vane owed, every mortgage he had leveraged to maintain his plastic lifestyle, and every square inch of the surrounding commercial property had been moved into a single holding company. Kenji looked at the framed photo of his late father on the desk, the man who had died before seeing justice served. He told Leo that Julian thought he was the king of the mountain, but he didn't realize the mountain was moving under his feet. He whispered to the photo that he was bringing it all back, every square inch of the dirt they had been told they weren't good enough to stand on. The quiet dignity he had maintained in the face of Julian's insults wasn't a sign of weakness. It was the stillness of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He wasn't just a tenant in Golden Heights anymore, he was the ghost of a past the Vanes thought they had buried, and he was finally ready to haunt them. The morning didn't bring peace, it brought the sharp, rhythmic pounding of a fist against wood. When Kenji opened his front door, he wasn't met with the soft chirping of suburban birds, but with the cold, bureaucratic glare of a man holding a clipboard. Behind him, Julian Vane stood on the sidewalk, his arms crossed over his cashmere sweater, a smirk of absolute victory playing on his lips. Without a word of greeting, the man with the clipboard shoved a legal-sized envelope into Kenji's chest. It was a 24-hour eviction notice, citing a litany of fabricated health and safety violations. The document was signed by a property management firm Kenji knew was deeply embedded in Julian's portfolio. Julian took a slow, theatrical step forward onto the grass, his eyes scanning the modest house as if he were looking at a pile of burning tires. He told Kenji that the clock was officially ticking and that by this time tomorrow, he wanted the infestation cleared out. He spoke with a casual, terrifying entitlement, suggesting that Kenji should be grateful he was getting 24 hours at all. As the day progressed, the neighborhood itself seemed to turn into a weapon. Sheila had not been idle. She had organized what she called a neighborhood beautification awareness walk. In reality, it was a gauntlet of hate. Every time Kenji or his mother stepped onto the porch to carry a box to the car, they were met with a wall of people. Wealthy residents in designer athletic gear stood on the public sidewalk, clutching their lattes like shields, staring with cold, unblinking eyes. Some whispered loudly about property values and those people, while Sheila marched back and forth, snapping photos of every item the Satos owned. She made a show of checking her diamond-encrusted watch and loudly announcing to the crowd that the neighborhood was finally breathing again. The isolation was total. When Kenji's elderly mother tried to nod a polite greeting to a neighbor she had shared small talk with for months, the woman simply looked through her, as if she were a ghost, and turned her back to adjust a sprinkler head. The tension snapped when a massive, rusted flatbed tow truck groaned into the cul-de-sac. Julian had called it in, claiming Kenji's station wagon was an abandoned hazard. Mika was still reaching into the backseat to grab her favorite school backpack when the driver, a man who looked like he'd been paid well to ignore the rules, began hooking the chains to the axle. Kenji rushed forward, but Julian stepped in his path, his hand flat against Kenji's chest. Julian told him to let it go, whispering that this was what happened when people tried to play in a league they couldn't afford. He laughed as the car was hoisted into the air, the metal screeching in protest. Mika began to cry, the sound of her heartbreak echoing off the multi-million-dollar mansions, but not a single window opened in sympathy. Instead, the neighbors turned on their high-powered irrigation systems, the cold water arching through the air and drenching the Satos as they stood on the curb with their remaining suitcases. Through the curtain of water and the jeers of the crowd, only one person watched with a different expression. Mrs. Higgins, the neighborhood's oldest resident, stood behind her sheer curtains in the house next door. She wasn't laughing or filming. Her hand trembled as she clutched a weathered leather file folder to her chest, her eyes darting between Julian's arrogant face and Kenji's soaking wet, stoic form. She had seen this play out once before, decades ago, when Julian's father had done the same thing to a different family. She was the silent ally, the witness to the original sin of Golden Heights, and as she watched the Satos stand humiliated on the street, she knew the secret she had kept for 40 years was finally heavy enough to break. Kenji felt her gaze and looked up, his eyes meeting hers for a fraction of a second. He didn't look like a victim. He looked like a man who was memorizing every face in the crowd, recording every insult, and preparing for the moment when the rain would stop and the fire would begin. The humiliation on the curb was supposed to be the end of the story, the final nail in the coffin of the Sato family's dignity. Julian Vane stood on his manicured lawn, swirling a glass of amber scotch, watching with a victor's grin as Kenji and his family shivered in their damp clothes. But the air in the cul-de-sac changed the moment a sleek, jet-black SUV with tinted windows rolled silently to a stop in front of the evicted family. A man in a sharp, slate-gray suit stepped out, carrying a leather attaché case that looked like it held the secrets of a nation. Julian let out a sharp, barking laugh, mocking Kenji for apparently calling a high-end Uber to ferry his failure away. He shouted across the street, telling the driver he was wasting his time because the people on the curb didn't have enough lunch money to cover the fare, let alone the tip. The man in the suit didn't look at Julian. He walked straight to Kenji, bowed his head slightly in a gesture of profound respect, and handed him a single, heavy vellum envelope. Julian's curiosity got the better of his arrogance, and he sauntered over, Sheila trailing behind him with her phone camera still rolling. Julian reached out, trying to snatch the paper, sneering that it was probably just a restraining order to keep the trash away from the neighborhood gates. But Kenji didn't pull away. He held the document up, letting the late afternoon sun catch the gold embossed seal at the top. It wasn't a restraining order. It was a notice of default and immediate foreclosure. Julian's eyes darted across the text, his smug expression flickering for the first time as he saw his own home address listed at the top. He stammered, claiming it was a prank, a forgery, or some kind of pathetic, ethnic joke. He told Kenji that he was a high-frequency trader, a man of substance, and that a janitor in a faded windbreaker couldn't possibly understand how real estate worked. Then, Kenji Sato did something that made the blood in Julian's veins turn to ice. He stood up straight, his shoulders broadening as the tired, humble mask he had worn for months simply evaporated. His voice, which had always been quiet and apologetic, shifted into a resonant, icy command that seemed to vibrate through the very pavement. He told Julian that while he was busy recording videos for social media and bullying elderly women, Sato Global had been quietly moving through the shadows. Kenji explained, with a terrifyingly calm precision, that Julian's lifestyle was built on a house of cards, specifically, high-interest bridge loans and leveraged debt. Kenji looked Julian in the eye and informed him that at exactly 9 o'clock that morning, Sato Global had purchased the property management firm, the outstanding debt on every mansion on the block, and the very ground beneath their feet. The silence that followed was deafening. Sheila's phone hand began to tremble, and she slowly lowered the camera as the realization dawned on her. Julian's face went from a shade of bright, angry red to a sickly, translucent gray. He tried to laugh it off, his voice cracking as he called Kenji a fraud, but the man in the suit, Leo, handed Julian a second document. It was a business card. The logo on the card matched the one on the side of the massive construction cranes that sat at the edge of the development. Kenji told Julian that he wasn't leaving the neighborhood today. In fact, he had decided to stay and watch the demolition. He leaned in, his voice a low, lethal whisper, and told Julian that he was no longer the victim of this story. He was now the landlord. Instead of reacting with the explosive anger Julian expected, Kenji simply turned to his mother and daughter and told them to get into the SUV. He looked back at Julian one last time and said that he had spent 25 years learning how to play the long game, and Julian had just lost on the very first move. The hunter had become the prey, and for the first time in his life, Julian Vane felt the cold, sharp edge of a world that didn't care who his father was. The following week in Golden Heights felt like the slow, rhythmic drawing of a bowstring, tension building in the silence of the suburban air. While Julian Vane retreated into his glass fortress, frantically pacing behind closed curtains and barking desperate orders into his phone, Kenji Sato moved with the terrifying precision of a master architect. He didn't stay in the rental house. He moved his family into the top floor of the city's most exclusive 5-star hotel, but he returned to the block every single morning. He didn't come to argue. He came to observe. He would stand on the sidewalk of the empty lot across from Julian's mansion, wearing a clean, high-visibility vest over his simple clothes, a clipboard in hand, and a team of geotechnical engineers trailing behind him like a small army. The neighborhood was in a state of quiet panic. Sheila, whose bravado had evaporated the moment she realized her own mortgage was likely held by a man she had filmed like a common criminal, tried to pivot. She arrived at the empty lot one Tuesday morning clutching an expensive artisanal gift basket filled with organic cheeses and imported wines. She walked toward Kenji with a forced, trembling smile, her high heels catching in the gravel. She started to apologize, her voice thin and desperate, claiming there had been a massive misunderstanding and that she had always valued diversity in the neighborhood. Kenji didn't even look up from his survey maps. He didn't acknowledge her presence until a homeless man, weary and tattered, happened to be walking past the construction site. Without breaking his stride, Kenji took the gift basket from Sheila's frozen hands and handed it to the man, telling him to enjoy a good meal. He then turned back to his blueprints, leaving Sheila standing in the dust, her mouth hanging open as she realized that her social currency was now worth absolutely nothing. The psychological warfare was subtle but devastating. On Wednesday, a massive flatbed truck arrived and dropped off a series of heavy wooden signs. By noon, the perimeter of Julian's property was dotted with bright yellow placards that read, demolition pending, structural revaluation. Every time Julian tried to leave his driveway in his supercar, he was forced to stop and wait as Kenji's loyal assistant, Leo, directed a fleet of rumbling construction vehicles to block the path. Leo would check his watch with agonizing slowness, offer a polite but hollow apology about necessary infrastructure upgrades, and force Julian to sit in his air-conditioned leather seat, fuming as he stared at the Sato Global logo emblazoned on every truck. Julian's desperation began to leak out of the house like a foul odor. He spent his nights calling every powerful friend, every corrupt politician, and every high-priced lawyer he had ever known, only to find the same chilling result. The lines were dead. One by one, they told him the same thing, that Kenji Sato hadn't just bought the debt, he had hired their firms for multi-year retainers or acquired their parent companies altogether. Julian was being suffocated by his own world. He looked out his window to see the neighbors who had once cheered for the Sato's eviction now leaving "Welcome home" cards and expensive floral arrangements on the hood of Kenji's industrial truck. They were predators who sensed a change in the alpha, and they were ready to eat Julian alive to save themselves. Inside his hotel suite, Kenji sat with Mika, helping her with her math homework as if the world outside wasn't in the middle of a seismic shift. He watched her solve a complex equation and smiled, telling her that the loudest man in the room is usually the one with the most to hide. He wasn't fueled by a hot, impulsive rage, he was fueled by a cold, generational justice. He spent his late nights reviewing the legal files he had uncovered, years of Julian's secret embezzlement and tax shelters that had been hidden in the neighborhood's complex accounting. The trap was no longer just about the land, it was about the legacy of a bully who thought he was untouchable. Kenji was no longer just setting a trap, he was building a cage, and the door was about to lock for good. The annual Golden Heights Gala was the crowning jewel of the community's social calendar, an evening where the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the underlying metallic tang of desperate status-seeking. The community clubhouse had been transformed into a palace of white silk and crystal, glowing under the soft amber light of 100 chandeliers. Julian Vane stood in the center of the ballroom, his tuxedo tailored to a razor's edge, clutching a crystal flute of vintage champagne. He was sweating beneath the silk lining of his jacket, his eyes darting toward the entrance every time the heavy oak doors creaked open. He was trying to rally the WA board members, whispering frantically about legal technicalities and hostile takeovers, but the very people who had shared his cigars a week ago now kept a careful, polite distance, their eyes wandering over his shoulder. The atmosphere in the room shifted from frantic whispering to a vacuum of pure silence when the doors finally swung wide. Kenji Sato didn't creep in, he arrived with the quiet, gravitational pull of a celestial body. He wasn't wearing the faded windbreaker or the cargo pants of a laborer. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the light around it, every stitch speaking of a wealth so old and deep it didn't need to shout. Beside him, his mother walked with her head held high, draped in a silk kimono that shimmered like moonlight, and Mika followed in a velvet dress, looking like a young princess entering her own court. The janitor they had mocked was gone, replaced by a man whose presence commanded the room before he even spoke a word. Julian's face twisted into a mask of desperate, trembling rage. He broke away from the board members, his footsteps echoing too loudly on the marble floor as he intercepted Kenji. He tried to summon his old arrogance, but his voice was an octave too high, cracking as he demanded to know what Kenji thought he was doing here. He pointed a shaking finger at Kenji's chest, shouting for everyone to hear that this man was a fraud, a common criminal who had probably stolen the suit he was wearing. He turned to the crowd, his eyes wild, begging them to remember the video Sheila had filmed, the video that proved these people were trash, who didn't belong in their world. He was a man drowning in a shallow pool, splashing violently to convince everyone he was still the king of the sea. Sheila stepped forward from the shadows of a floral arrangement, her face tight with a mixture of fear and malice. She held up her phone, her thumb hovering over the play button, her voice shrill as she told the room that she had evidence of their low-class behavior. She sneered at Kenji's mother, checking her watch with that familiar, sharp snap of her wrist, telling them they had 5 minutes to leave before she called the real authorities. The crowd stood frozen, caught between the old world of Julian's bullying and the new, terrifying reality of Kenji's arrival. Kenji didn't interrupt her. He stood perfectly still, sipping a glass of sparkling water, his eyes tracking the frantic movements of his enemy with the patience of a mountain. He watched as Julian stood on the small orchestra stage, grabbing a microphone and screeching about neighborhood integrity and outsiders. The more Julian shouted, the smaller he looked. The more Sheila filmed, the more pathetic she appeared. The air was heavy with the irony of it. Julian was doing exactly what he had accused Kenji of doing, making a scene and devaluing the vibe of the room. Just as Julian reached a fever pitch, accusing Kenji of being nothing more than a ghost from a past that didn't matter, a soft, clearing of a throat came from the front of the room. Mrs. Higgins, the oldest resident of Golden Heights, stepped out of the crowd. She wasn't looking at the cameras or the chandeliers. She was looking at Kenji with a look of profound, tearful relief. She held a weathered leather file folder against her heart, her knuckles white. She looked at Julian, then at the crowd, and said in a voice that was small but carried to every corner of the ballroom that she had something the board, and the world, needed to see. The grand setup was complete. Every player was on the board, and the trap was finally ready to be sprung. The air in the grand ballroom became a vacuum as Mrs. Higgins walked toward the stage, her footsteps small but heavy with the weight of 40 years of guilt. Julian stood paralyzed, the microphone still clutched in his hand, a bead of sweat tracing a jagged line down his temple. Mrs. Higgins didn't look at him. She opened the weathered leather file and produced a series of yellowed, ink-signed documents, placing them onto the overhead projector used for neighborhood presentations. The giant screen behind Julian flickered to life, showing the original 1950s deed to the land and a handwritten confession from Arthur Vane. The silence was absolute. The room watched in horror as the evidence laid out a decades-old crime, the systematic theft of the Sato family's land through forged signatures and backroom deals. Then came the climax twist that shattered Julian's world. Kenji took the stage, not with a shout, but with a presence that seemed to grow until he towered over everything Julian had ever known. Kenji revealed that the property management company he had purchased wasn't just a business move. It had unlocked the reversionary clause in the neighborhood charter. Because Julian had engaged in illegal embezzlement to fund his lavish lifestyle, a clause triggered that returned the title of the land to the original historical owners. Kenji looked at the crowd and then at Julian, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register as he informed Julian that he didn't just own the block. He owned the dirt beneath Julian's feet, and the house Julian called a fortress was now legally a pile of materials sitting on Kenji's private property. Julian's reaction was visceral. The color didn't just drain from his face, it vanished, leaving him a sickly, translucent gray. He began to stammer, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine as he claimed there was some kind of mistake. He looked at the neighbors, his friends, but they were all staring at the screen, then back at him with looks of utter disgust. Sheila's phone hand was shaking so violently that she dropped the device, the screen cracking against the marble floor, a perfect metaphor for the collapse of her digital vanity. Julian began to scream that it was his house, that he had worked for it, that he was a Vane. But his words were empty noise against the cold, hard truth of the law. The final reveal came when Kenji signaled to Leo, who pressed a button on a remote. The massive projectors transitioned from the old deeds to a high-definition video, the one Sheila had filmed of Julian's racist tirade on the driveway. The entire elite community watched as Julian's sneering face filled the screen, heard him calling the Satos ethnic filth and trash. The irony was suffocating. Julian was the one who had brought the neighborhood value down. He was the stain he had been trying to scrub away. Kenji walked to the edge of the stage, looking down at Julian as if he were an insignificant bug. He told Julian that he wasn't interested in his money, his excuses, or his apologies. He delivered the killing blow with a chilling calm, informing Julian that he had exactly 30 minutes to return to his mansion and take whatever he could fit into the trunk of his car. Everything else, the furniture, the art, the legacy, was now property of the Sato Foundation. As Julian collapsed to his knees, begging for a week, a day, even an hour, 2 uniformed police officers stepped out from the back of the room. Kenji handed them a folder containing the evidence of Julian's tax fraud and embezzlement. The room erupted into a cacophony of gasps as the handcuffs clicked shut around Julian's wrists. The man who had spent his life looking down on everyone was now being led out of his own gala in shame, his head bowed, his tailored tuxedo wrinkled and stained with sweat. Kenji stood at the center of the stage, his mother and daughter by his side, and looked out at the silent, stunned residents of Golden Heights. He didn't offer a smile of triumph. Instead, he told them that the gates of the community were being taken down tomorrow morning, because a neighborhood built on fear and exclusion isn't a community, it's a prison. And he was finally setting them all free. The dust of the confrontation eventually settled, leaving a quietness in Golden Heights that was no longer hollow or exclusive, but peaceful. Julian Vane's exit from the neighborhood was not the grand, dignified departure he had always imagined. Instead of a matte black supercar, he left in the back of a county sheriff's cruiser, his wrists bound in steel, his eyes fixed on the floorboards as the neighbors he once ruled with an iron sneer watched from their porches in stony silence. His wealth, built on the shifting sands of debt and inherited theft, evaporated within weeks. The public shaming was total. The viral video of his tirade became a permanent digital scar that no high-priced PR firm could ever heal. He ended up exactly where he had feared to be, penniless, stripped of his title, and forced to face the reality of a world that owed him nothing. The transformation of the block began the very next morning. Kenji didn't build a taller fence or a more elaborate gate. Instead, the heavy iron bars at the entrance of Golden Heights were dismantled and hauled away for scrap. The empty lot that Julian had obsessed over was not used for a high-rise fortress. It became the Sato Community Garden and Youth Center. Where there once were glares and recording phones, there were now the sounds of children playing and the smell of earth being turned. Sheila, the woman who had lived to police the movements of others, found herself on the other side of the law. As part of her court-mandated community service for her role in the WA embezzlement scandal, she was seen every Saturday morning in a bright orange vest, picking up litter along the very sidewalks she had once tried to wash the Satos away from. She no longer checked her expensive watch with a snap. She looked at it only to see how many hours of penance she had left. 5 years passed like a slow, healing breath. Golden Heights had changed. The houses were still beautiful, but the atmosphere was lighter, filled with a diverse tapestry of families who bought into the neighborhood not for the prestige, but for the community. On a warm autumn afternoon, Kenji Sato sat on a wooden bench in the heart of the garden he had built. He was still wearing his old Local 42 windbreaker, the fabric thin and comfortable. He watched as a young immigrant family, carrying boxes into a renovated townhouse down the street, paused to look around. They looked tired, their clothes dusty from the move, reminding him so much of the man he had been decades ago. Mika, now a confident young woman home from her first year at a prestigious university, sat down beside him. She leaned her head on his shoulder and asked if he ever missed the quiet of the old days. Kenji looked at the vibrant life around them, the elderly Mrs. Higgins teaching a group of teenagers how to prune rosebushes, the sound of laughter echoing from the open gates. He shook his head and told her that true peace isn't the absence of people, but the presence of justice. He stood up, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the new family. In his hand, he carried a small, fresh jar of pickled ginger, a gift from his mother's kitchen. As he reached them, he didn't look at their old car or their tired faces with judgment. He offered a warm, genuine smile and told them, "Welcome home." He had learned that the height of a man is never truly measured by the size of the house he lives in, but by the size of the gates he is willing to tear down. Karma had come for Julian Vane, not as a sudden blow, but as a mirror, showing him the emptiness of his own soul. For Kenji, success wasn't the revenge he had achieved. It was the legacy of kindness he had planted in the very soil that was once stolen from him. The lesson remained etched into the heart of the block. You should never judge a book by its cover, for the man you kick out today might just be the one who owns the ground you stand on tomorrow. Kindness costs nothing, but a lack of it can cost you everything.